Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Morphy Auction Company, taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming April of 2019 firearms auction. And today we have something that you very rarely get a chance to see, and that is a Soviet AVS-36 automatic rifle. We normally here in the US, we like to think of having been the first country to adopt a standard semi-automatic service rifle. For every soldier, not just a specialist weapon like the RSCs or like the Fedorovs. Well, we did do that, but we weren't necessarily the first, because the AVS-36 is actually the first. It predates the actual US production and adoption of the M1 Garand. Now, the AVS-36 would prove to have some problems, and it would be replaced after just a couple years in service, but this is the first rifle in the path that would lead to millions of SVT-40s being produced in the Soviet Union during World War II. So, the designer, Sergei Simonov, or Simonov, I think it's Simonov, hopefully it's Simonov, was actually started off his career apprenticed to two of the most famous and most notable Soviet firearms designers that there were at the time, Degtyarev and Fedorov. In 1918, he went to work as, well, basically an assistant, a floor sweeper sort of guy for the Russian, one of the Russian arms factories, and showed some serious talent. He was curious, he was interested, he was smart, he was clever, and he was became very interested in firearms design, and this caught the attention of Fedorov and Degtyarev, and so they kind of took him under their wing and helped tutor him and helped develop his skills at firearms design. Now, the Soviets would start this process of formally adopting a self-loading rifle in the mid-1920s. And in fact, there was a series of rifle trials in 1926, 1928, 1930, with a whole bunch of entrants. This is akin to a lot of the semi-auto rifle trials that were going on at the time. Lots of experienced designers, guys like Fedorov, Degtyarev, Tokarev as well, and then also lots of names that you've never heard of. Guys like Uraznov, Kuznetsov, and Bezrukov, who were all entrants in the 1928 trials. None of these trials produced a weapon that was actually considered sufficient or acceptable, as was the case in pretty much all of the self-loading military trials around the world. The US as well. We would go through a bunch of trials where the result was, none of you guys are good enough. So go back, build some more stuff, and let's try again in a year or two. Well, and in fact, Simonov had submitted a rifle to that very first 1926 trial, but wasn't so great. In fact, it was so not great that it wasn't even let into the trials. It was kind of rejected out of hand. We're not even going to waste our time testing this thing. But he went back and he started tinkering and he kept working. And in 1930, he had a much improved design. And by the end of the trials, a lot of the other contenders had been knocked out. And I should mention, a lot of those early trials guns, in fact, most of them were recoil-operated guns. And one of the things that the ultimate winners of this whole process, which would be Simonov and Tokarev, the thing that they really did was they started using a gas piston operating system. And in fact, they used a gas piston system that would go on to be, well, it's still used to this very day. It was the system that would be in the SVT-40. It would then move on and be in the German G43. The Germans adapted it because it was a really good system. It would go on to be in the Armalite 18 or 180, AR-180, and we see it in a wide variety of 5.56 caliber service rifles today. And this is pretty much the oldest iteration of it in an actual service configuration. So that's pretty cool. Now, overall, this gun has some issues. This is clearly an early generation self-loading rifle, and you'll see that when we take it apart. In fact, why don't we go ahead and just take it apart right now. Before we can take this apart, I need to show you some of the stuff on the outside, because there is a lot to go over on this rifle. So, first of all, I should point out, because I don't think I did before, that this is actually selective fire. Full auto and semi-auto. It does have a selector switch on the back. And as part of attempting to make this somewhat controllable, they put a quite significant muzzle brake on the front. So we've got that. We then have a cleaning rod on the side of the gun. You'd see the same sort of thing on the SVT-38, although they did drop it on the SVT-40. There is an adjustable gas block on the front, so you can tweak the amount of gas that you're getting to match your ammunition. This metal handguard is here because the gas piston is right in here, and this is where it vents excess gas each time it cycles. So that's why you see this metal section on the SVT and AVS rifles is you don't have wood up here that's going to get charred and damaged over time from that gas. Moving backward, this is actually part of our gas piston, and we'll see that in a moment. You'll notice this is an Ejector manufactured gun. They were all produced at Ejector. We have a pretty typical rear sight here, good for 1,500 meters. Date for this particular rifle is 1939, although it had been technically replaced by that time. Production hadn't ended entirely. A little bit of a close-up on the Ejector marking there. On the opposite side, we have the serial number, which is 2 Cyrillic letters, and then 127. This isn't an entirely matching gun, as you can see from the different number on the bolt handle. We do have a stripper clip guide for reloading, as well as a 15-round magazine. These look very similar to the magazines from the Tokarev, the SVT-40. They are not actually interchangeable because the magazine hold-open tabs are not in the same place. The SVT, that's central mounted. On the Simonov rifles, it's offset to the right. So unfortunately, you can't take these mags and use them in your SVT, although you probably wouldn't anyway because these mags are extremely rare and difficult to find. This gun actually has 2 of them, which is pretty cool. Locking system is basically identical to the Tokarev. It's a nose-in, rock-back magazine with just a simple lever release at the back. There was a sniper version of the AVS-36. That's what this rail on the side is for, mounting, I believe, a PE or maybe a PEM scope. Continuing back, we have a sliding dust cover on the back end of the gun. This one's in kind of bad condition. It probably needs to be bent a little bit back into shape because it's a little floppy. But the idea here is you can push this thing to the front, and it's supposed to stay in there just from a little spring tension. And that closes up this open slot in the side of the receiver. And then when you cycle the bolt handle, it slides back like that to allow, well, the bolt handle to cycle back through here. And this is it's a manual dust cover. So when you're done shooting and you want to close the rifle up, you have to put it back in position manually. At the back here, we have our selector switch. The top position is semi-auto. The bottom position is full auto. It helps to pull this out just a little bit to lift it out of its locking notch, and then you can snap it down or up. It's remarkable how simple the function of that lever is, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. The safety is this lever at the back of the trigger guard, and that's also extremely simple. All it does is physically block the trigger from going back. And then lastly, we have a couple markings on the stock. We've got the serial number repeated again, and then we have this acceptance proof. Old school Soviet Union there, CCCP and hammer and sickle inside a laurel. All right, now we can take this apart, and it's a pretty simple process. There's only one screw that you have to take out, so start by removing the cleaning rod, just to get that out of the way. The upper handguard is held in place by this locking pin. Rotate it 90 degrees, and then it will come out like so. Now this is a loose pin. There's no good place to put this again, which is one of the downsides of the design. But like I said, this is a very early semi-auto rifle. Now, with that pin out, we can slide this back. That comes off the gun, and this is just the upper handguard. The metal that you see out here is actually continued all the way back. This is fully metal shrouded on the inside. And then it locks into place around the rear sight block back here. There's the back end of your gas system. There's a gas block here. Gas is going to come up into there, control how much goes through with that plug, and then when it cycles, this is going to get pushed backwards like that, and it's going to push this connecting rod here, which attaches to this block. So when this cycles, this whole block gets pushed backwards. If I use the rod up the front, you can see it just like that. There's a little return spring right under there that pushes it back. And this acts just as basically a connecting rod. So this block pushes on this top of what is actually sort of our bolt carrier. When this cycles, it's going to just push back like that. This block pushing on this surface right here. So you can see how they interact there. Now to take apart the rear end, we are going to take this selector lever and we're actually going to pull it out away from the gun, lift it up 90 degrees, and then it will also come out. And then, whoop, there goes our receiver cover, which is under some spring tension. This, you may notice, looks fairly similar to the Tokarev, just a spring guide in there. That is a solid spring guide, by the way. It is not telescoping. That's just a rear receiver cover with a stripper clip guide. It's a fairly complex piece, but it doesn't actually do anything additional. Coiled wire mainspring, which is cool. All right, continuing on, note that we have still not used any tools. We are going to pull the bolt back, bring it back to here, and then it just lifts out of the gun. Set that aside. Now we've got, that's your basic field stripping. However, we're going to go one step farther, and we are going to take the magazine well and trigger guard off. There is a secured screw here, so what I have to do is actually push that center button in. There we go, like that. That prevents this screw from coming loose while you're shooting, which is important because this screw actually has multiple functions. Right? Once that screw comes out, then the trigger guard is actually hinged right there, so I can pivot it up like that and then slide it out. And then the action, well, the stock lifts off the action. All right, we have a lot to look at here, so let's start with the locking system. There are actually 3 different locking surfaces in this rifle, which is pretty kind of quirky. So we have a locking flap here, sticks out of the bolt. We have a similar locking flap right here. They're not symmetrical, but they each come out one side of the gun, and you can see a locking recess right above my finger right there, and one on the other side right here. This rifle is striker fired, not hammer fired, and this is the back end of our striker. And when that gets released, which by the way happens when the bolt goes all the way forward, when the striker is released and pushes forward, its body is actually going to force both of these locking wedges out of the bolt body, which forces them to lock in the receiver. This one can actually open up farther since the receiver is not there to hold it in. The firing pin then protrudes from the bolt face and it fires. And you might look at this and say, that doesn't seem like all that much locking surface for a rifle in 7.62 by 54 rimmed, a true full power rifle cartridge. Well, you would be right. You might also notice this square recess and think, I wonder what that does. That is actually the most significant primary locking surface. Now before we go into the receiver, notice that there's this angled section on the top. We have a 2-part bolt and carrier, although the bolt is actually the main component here at the bottom, and we have this second piece, which I'm going to call the carrier. That's what it would typically be. The carrier is on the top. The carrier is what has the recoil spring acting on it. The recoil spring sits right in there. And when this goes forward, this wedge is actually going to act to force the locking block up. That locking block is right here, and it travels vertically. You can see it right there lifting up and dropping down inside the receiver. What happens is, if we see the top of it right up there, it's actually completely surrounding the bolt. So when it travels, the top has to go up, and the bottom then can lock into the bottom of the bolt. The way that's actually accomplished is that this angled surface pushes the top of the locking block up, which forces the bottom of it to engage into this surface. So as long as this piece is forward, the locking block must remain elevated because this wedge is holding it all the way up. Then, when the gas piston cycles, it's going to hit this top semicircular portion of the bolt carrier, which is going to force it backwards. That is going to recock the striker. This is a tricky thing to do by hand. It's going to recock the striker right there, which allows these 2 locking flaps to come in, and it also brings this back out of the locking block, which allows the locking block to drop down. That frees the bolt and allows the whole bolt to reciprocate backward and cycle. I can show you that in action. Note that there is no hammer in here. We just have a striker, or a Sear, right it doesn't have a spring on it right now. So there's a Sear right there that's going to catch the striker and hold it in place. But we'll get to the trigger mechanism in a minute. When I put this in, there we go, that drops in there. This whole thing is going to go forward. The Sear is going to catch on the striker tail right there. You can see the striker tail stops, top of the bolt carrier continues forward. This gets really stiff right here because at this point that wedge has to push the locking block up. So there's the bottom of it. When I push this all the way into battery, you can see that locking block is going to move up. There we go. Now it's locked in place, and in fact, because we don't have the trigger mechanism in place, it let go of our Sear here. And so now we have both this block holding the bolt in, and we also have the two wedges, flappers, on the side of the bolt. Then of course this is going to come backwards, which pushes this back. It's gonna do it like that, and then there we go. This is quite tight to lock and unlock. So then this comes back and cycles like a regular firearm. Now we can take a look at the fire control group, which is also a very interesting one. And it's got, I mean, this thing just comes basically completely loose. So let me put that back where it's supposed to be. By the way, this block is the pin that holds the ejector in place. So we've got a couple other items inside here that I should mention briefly. This, with a big one, the main one, is the ejector right there, which is going to kick empty cases out. That is spring-loaded and on a pin, so that when the bolt goes forward, the ejector goes down. This block is hit by the bolt, and that's what actually pushes the ejector down. You want the ejector to be very hard so that it doesn't bend or deform when it's kicking cases out. But if it's hard, it tends to be brittle, and you don't want the bolt slamming into it every time. So instead, the bolt hits this block, which is connected to the ejector, to push it down when the bolt goes forward. So that's that part. We then have this tab right here, and that is the bolt hold open. So that is being pushed up by this tab on the back of the follower, so that when the magazine is empty, that presents itself, pushes this up, which then hits the bolt and stops it, hence locking the gun open. This pin right here goes all the way through, connects to this block. In fact, I can push it a little ways out so that you can see that. It's starting to come out there. And that's just what holds all of these pieces in place. And then we have this guy right here, which is the Sear. So as the trigger bar here goes in and out, that Sear is going to go up and down, which is what allows the gun to fire. At the other end of this bar is this block, which acts as a semi-auto disconnector. So when this is in the upward position and exposed inside the receiver here, when the bolt comes back, it's going to push this down, which causes the trigger to reset. If you look at the trigger here, you'll notice that we have an angled wedge on the bottom, we have an angled wedge on the top, and there's actually this open space in between. That open space is there so that when this bar is pushed down by the bolt, the trigger snaps back forward and resets. So all that the selector lever is doing is actually taking this bar and sliding it up and down. When it's in the upward position, that disconnector is in the receiver and functioning. And so when you pull the trigger back, that upper triangle acts on this little lug, which pulls this back, which drops the Sear and fires the rifle. And then when this comes down, like that, there's now nothing holding the trigger in place. The trigger resets forward, and then this gets pushed back up when you're ready to fire a second round. When you push this into full auto, it drops this down. And by the way, this screw hole is the screw for the screw that holds the trigger guard in place. So this screw comes up into here, and it actually acts as the bottom. It prevents this bar from going too far down. That bar gets sandwiched between the trigger guard screw here and the selector lever here. So in the full auto position, we are now using the bottom triangle to actually fire the gun. However, the disconnector has been dropped down outside of the receiver and no longer does anything. So as long as you hold the trigger back with this selector lever down, this stays backward, which means the Sear stays down. This is There we go. Stays back. Sear stays down, and the gun will keep firing until you release the trigger or you run out of ammo. Now, the trigger guard itself is essential to make this loose, floppy thing actually work, because the trigger guard has a pair of flat springs. It's actually one long flat spring that does two jobs. So first off, the front end here is dovetailed into the front magazine well block. So what we're going to do is put that in there, and then you can see that this kind of pivots in like so. We're going to bring the trigger back, and this is the position that this whole thing is in when it's actually working. So we have a flat spring here that is constantly pushing the Sear up, which ensures that the gun doesn't fire when the bolt goes home. And then we have this spring, which is constantly pushing the trigger bar forward. Now you can see how this whole thing actually cycles. So this is semi-auto, and when I pull the trigger, the bar is going to come back, which causes this Sear to drop. The bolt, however, is going to trip the disconnector. Note how the Sear rises. So I can continue holding the trigger, but the Sear has gone up. It's not going to fire again until I release the trigger. The trigger bar can go back up, and then I can fire again. I'll disconnect like that. Now, to hold this in full auto, I'm actually going to put in the selector lever because I don't have enough hands to do this all manually. There we go. There is full auto. Now, when I pull the trigger back, the Sear drops, and it's just going to stay dropped until I release the trigger because this disconnector is dropped down outside of the receiver. So it'll fire full auto. Whew! So there is your field stripped AVS-36 select fire Soviet pre-World War II battle rifle. As the Russian trials progressed, ultimately by 1935 or 1936, it really came down to Simonov and Tokarev. And both rifles had pros and cons. Ultimately, the Tokarev would prove to be the more durable of the rifles. And the Simonov was a good design, it worked reasonably well, but it had more parts failures. Now, Simonov would go back and he would modify the design again, and he would actually fix those issues. The problem was, by the time he had fixed those issues, his redesign had increased the complexity of some of the parts to the point that now his gun was actually more expensive to produce than Tokarev's rifle. Both in terms of material cost, how much steel had to go into it. It was like an extra kilo and 3/4 of steel that was required to make a Simonov rifle, and also in cost. It was just under 7 rubles more expensive in labor terms, even in Soviet Union labor terms, to produce one of these than it was a Tokarev rifle. So, and it didn't hurt that Stalin knew Tokarev and liked Tokarev. Stalin thought the bayonet on the Tokarev rifle was a better type of bayonet than Simonov's, although I think Simonov's was probably the more practical of the two. Ultimately, Tokarev gets chosen. Now, this wouldn't really slow down Simonov. You may recognize his name from some later guns, like the SKS, as well as the PTRS. So he would go on to have a very successful and notable career in the Soviet arms design bureaus, but it wouldn't be entirely because of this rifle. The rifle would be adopted as the AVS-36. Real, actual, substantial production would begin in 1937 with a little more than 10,000 produced. It would scale up again to about 24,000 made in 1938. In total, they would produce about 65,000 of these rifles by 1940 when they ceased production. This was replaced by the SVT-38, which was then replaced by the SVT-40, but these production timetables are all overlapping. So they didn't immediately drop this rifle as soon as they decided to replace it with a different rifle, because they already had production lines running, tooling in place, parts in various stages of manufacture. These were good enough rifles that they were worth finishing out a production schedule and not being terribly inefficient with it. But at the same time that they were, scaling down production of this, they'd be scaling up production of, say, the SVT-38. You'll see the same thing going on with Kalashnikov rifles as they transition between different models of the AK in its earlier, more developmental days. The production of two competing models would actually overlap. So, ultimately, this was first seen in public in 1938 at the May Day parade. They did also make a sniper version, a scoped version with a PE scope on the side. But in total, only about 65,000 of them made. And of course, that was right before World War II, the Great Patriotic War. And so very few of these have survived to this day. There's only a handful of them here in the United States, and it's really cool to get a chance to take a look at this one, tear it apart, and show you guys how it works. So if you are interested in having it yourself, it is of course coming up for sale here at Morphy's. If you take a look at the description text below the video, you'll find a link to ForgottenWeapons.com, and from there you can click over to Morphy's catalog page on this guy, take a look at their pictures, their description, their price estimate. This is a fully registered and transferable, curio and relic eligible registered machine gun because it is select fire. So anyone who can pass an NFA background check can add this cool, awesome piece of firearms history to your own personal collection. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.